Have you ever wondered if the air in the Middle Ages smelled like wood smoke and hay? It didn't. It smelled like iron. It smelled like copper. It smelled like the breath of thousands of people gathered in a town square to watch a human being turned into a memory. In the 21st century, we fear the unknown. In the 14th century, they feared the known. They feared the shadow of the executioner. They feared the sound of a hammer hitting bone. Today, we aren't just looking at history. We are looking at the absolute limit of human cruelty. Are you ready to witness the moments where mercy went to die? Medieval Europe was not just a time of kings and stone castles. It was a time of silence, the kind of silence that follows a scream. Imagine waking up in a small village. The sun is just touching the horizon, but you don't hear birds. You hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of a wooden stage being built in the center of the market. This was the scaffold. This was the stage where the law performed its final act. Public executions were not hidden behind high prison walls. They were the main event. They were the justice that every child, every mother, and every shopkeeper was forced to breathe in. To the medieval mind, a crime wasn't just a broken rule. It was a stain on the universe. And that stain had to be scrubbed away with a blade, a rope, or a fire. Why was it public? Because the crown didn't just want you dead. They wanted you to be a lesson. They wanted your neighbors to see your face go pale. They wanted your friends to hear the exact moment your spirit broke. The crowd didn't always come for bloodlust. They came because they had no choice. If you didn't watch, you were suspicious. If you looked away, you might be next. The atmosphere was thick. Imagine thousands of people packed so tight you can feel the heat of their bodies. There is a strange, nervous energy. Some people whisper prayers. Others sell bread and wine just a few feet away from the chopping block. It is a festival of the macabre. The executioner arrives, usually wearing a mask, not to hide his shame, but to hide his humanity. He is no longer a man. He is the hand of God, or the hand of the king, and he is there to do a job that even the bravest soldiers would tremble to think about. The reality of death back then was far worse than the movies show us. There was no clean ending. There were no painkillers. There was only the cold, hard wood of the platform and the realization that your last few minutes on earth would be the most public moments of your life. The law didn't just want to take your life, it wanted to take your dignity. It wanted to turn your body into a roadside warning that would rot in the sun for weeks. This was the theater of the damned, and the first act is about to begin. The crowd grows quiet. The prisoner is brought forward. And the first tool of agony is revealed. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The crowd moves back. A heavy, wooden wagon wheel is dragged onto the stage. It looks ordinary. It looks like something that should be carrying hay or grain. But today, it is an instrument of a nightmare. This is the breaking wheel. In Germany, France, and the cold reaches of Eastern Europe, they didn't call it an execution. They called it the answer. It was the answer for the murderers, the traitors, and the thieves who dared to disrupt the peace of the king. The prisoner is stripped. His limbs are stretched out across the spokes of the wheel. He is tied down so tightly that his skin begins to turn white. The executioner doesn't reach for a sword. He reaches for a heavy iron bar. It is thick. It is cold. It is designed for one thing: impact. The first blow lands. It doesn't cut. It smashes. In the silence of the town square, the sound of the first bone snapping is like a dry branch breaking in a winter forest. But it is louder. It is wetter. The crowd gasps. The prisoner's scream is sharp, but it is quickly cut short by the second blow. Then the third. The executioner is a craftsman. He isn't hitting randomly. He is working his way up the body. Ankles, shins, thighs, wrists, elbows. The goal isn't death. Not yet. The goal is to turn a human being into a human spider. Once the bones are shattered into small fragments, the executioner begins the threading. He takes the limp, broken limbs and weaves them through the wooden spokes of the wheel. The body is twisted into shapes that no living person should ever take. The joints are gone. There is only the wheel and the mangled flesh. Sometimes, if the judge is feeling merciful, he orders the coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or head to end the suffering. But most of the time, there is no mercy. The wheel is lifted high into the air on a tall wooden pole. The prisoner is still alive. He is looking down at the crowd through eyes filled with a pain that words cannot describe. He is left there, under the scorching sun, under the freezing rain. The birds are the first to arrive. They don't wait for him to die. They start with the eyes. They start with the soft tissue. The townspeople pass by on their way to the market. They look up. They see the roadside warning. Children grow up seeing these wheels as a part of the landscape, like trees or wells. They see the bones bleaching in the sun until they are as white as salt. The fear doesn't leave when the person dies. The fear lingers. It settles into the soil. It stays in the whispers of the tavern. People believe the soul is trapped in those broken bones, hovering above the wheel, unable to find peace because the body was never given a grave. The breaking wheel didn't just break a man, it broke the spirit of anyone who watched. But as the sun sets on the wheel, another horror is being prepared across the border. A horror that doesn't use iron bars, but sharpened wood. If the breaking wheel was a symphony of shattered bone, then the forest of stakes was a silent, frozen nightmare. Imagine riding your horse toward the borders of Wallachia in the 15th century. The air is still. The wind carries a scent you can't quite name, sweet, metallic, and heavy. You round a hill, and suddenly, the horizon is no longer made of trees. It is made of people. Thousands of them. High in the air, held up by nothing but sharpened wood. This wasn't just an execution. This was a message written in human geometry. Mass impalement was the signature of Vlad III, the man history remembers as the Impaler. He didn't just want to kill his enemies. He wanted to paralyze the world with a single glance. Chroniclers say he once ordered 20,000 prisoners to be displayed all at once. Imagine the scale. A literal forest where every tree is a stake and every leaf is a dying man. This wasn't a legend told to scare children. Turkish soldiers, hardened by 100 battles, reportedly turned their horses around and fled when they saw this sight. It was too much for the human mind to process. The process of impalement was a cold, mathematical horror. It required a specific kind of cruelty. The stake was thick, usually as wide as a man's arm. The tip wasn't always razor-sharp. Sometimes it was rounded and greased with oil. Why? Because a sharp point kills too fast. The goal was to slide the wood through the body without hitting the heart, the lungs, or the vital organs. It was a slow, agonizing journey of wood through flesh. The victim was stripped, held down by soldiers who had done this 1,000 times. The stake would enter through the lower body and emerge from the shoulder, the chest, or even the mouth. Then, the stake was lifted. Gravity became the executioner. As the hours passed, the weight of the body would slowly pull it further down the wood. There was no screaming after the first few hours. There was only the sound of heavy, labored breathing and the buzzing of flies. Medieval scribes tell stories of heroes who lasted for days on the stake. They would watch their own friends die beside them. They would see the sun rise and set, their thirst becoming a fire in their throats, while the soldiers below sat by campfires, eating and laughing. The psychological impact turned entire countries cold. Locals refused to farm near these sites for generations. They believed the ground had drunk too much blood to ever grow grain again. Rumors spread that the ghosts of the impaled would scream whenever the wind blew through the empty ribcages left behind. Even the executioners, the men who greased the stakes and held the ropes, were often shunned by their own villages. They carried the smell of the forest of stakes with them. They were the men who had turned a beautiful valley into a graveyard of wood and bone. But as terrifying as the stakes were, there was another fate that waited for those who betrayed their trust, a fate that took away their very skin. Imagine a sentence that doesn't just end your life, but erases your very humanity. In medieval England, France, and the scorching deserts of Persia, there was a punishment reserved for the most hated, the corrupt judges, the tax collectors who stole from the poor, and the rebels who spat on the king's flag. The sentence was simple, yet it makes the stomach turn centuries later. They called it flaying, or, in simpler terms, being skinned alive. The message was clear: let the law wear the skin of the corrupt. This wasn't just about pain. It was about identity. In the Middle Ages, your skin was your protection, your pride, and your face to the world. To have it removed was to be turned into a raw, red statue of agony. It was the ultimate humiliation. It took away everything that made you look like a man and left you looking like a monster. The execution began not with a heavy blow, but with the terrifying precision of a small, sharp knife. The executioner had to be a master of his craft. If he cut too deep, the victim would bleed out and die too fast. If he was too shallow, the skin would tear. He needed a steady hand. In London, rumors whispered that certain executioners took a grim pride in their work. They aimed to remove the skin in one single, continuous piece, like a hollow ghost of the person who once was. Witnesses from the 13th century described the process starting at the head or the back. The crowd would watch in a trance of horror as the blade moved. Every nerve ending in the human body is concentrated in the skin. Imagine the sensation of the cold air hitting the raw flesh beneath. It is a level of sensory overload that usually drives the mind into immediate madness. But the executioners were patient. They would keep the victim conscious with salts or liquids just to ensure the lesson was fully learned. One famous story tells of a corrupt English official named William de Ockham. After his crimes were revealed, the king didn't just want him dead. He ordered William's skin to be nailed to the courthouse door. Why? So that every judge who walked through those doors for the next 50 years would have to touch the remains of a man who betrayed his oath. In Persia, they took it a step further. They would stuff the removed skin with straw, creating a life-sized, hollow doll of the victim, and hang it from the city gates. Travelers reported that the sight and the stench would keep a city on edge for months. It turned the very architecture of the town into a warning. Children would walk past these doors and hear their parents whisper, "This is the door where justice wears its enemies." You weren't just killed, you were repurposed into a piece of furniture for the state. You became a literal part of the building. Even when the body was long gone, the message remained in the stained wood and the nightmares of the witnesses. But while flaying was a theater of the knife, the next method used the most basic element of life to bring a boiling, blistering end. For those who think medieval executions were always about the blade or the rope, the cauldrons of the 16th century offer a different, more liquid kind of terror. Boiling alive was a punishment that turned the very act of cooking into a ritual of state-sponsored murder. It was not a myth or a campfire story. In England, King Henry VIII actually made boiling a legal punishment, specifically for poisoners. The logic was twisted. If you used a liquid to kill someone in secret, the law would use a liquid to kill you in public. Imagine a giant metal cauldron placed in the center of the square. It isn't filled with soup. It is filled with water, oil, or sometimes even molten lead. The prisoner is brought out, often tied to a pulley system. The crowd is silent. There is no music, only the sound of the fire crackling beneath the pot. Sometimes, the executioner would drop the victim into already boiling liquid for a quick death. But the more sadistic judges preferred a slow burn. They would place the victim in cold water and light the fire. As the water temperature rises, so does the tension. The prisoner feels the warmth first. Then the sting. Then the agony. First, the skin begins to scald and turn a deep, angry red. Then, blisters form, bubbling up across the limbs. The steam rises, thick and heavy, carrying the smell of cooking flesh across the city blocks. In 1531, a man named Richard Roos was boiled in London. Scribes recorded that the smell traveled for 2 city blocks, making the witnesses physically sick. The pain of boiling is unique because it is total. Every inch of the body is under attack at once. Organs begin to fail as the internal body temperature reaches impossible levels. Some victims would last for 20 minutes, their screams turning into wet, gurgling gasps as the steam scorched their lungs. The executioner would sometimes stir the pot with a long iron rod, ensuring that no part of the body escaped the heat. It was a slow, domestic horror that turned a kitchen tool into a monument of pain. But even this heat could not compare to the psychological terror of the sack of animals. This was a punishment reserved for those who committed parricide, the killing of a parent. It was called poenacule. The prisoner was not just killed, they were removed from the human world. They were sewn into a heavy leather or linen sack. But they weren't alone. Inside the sack, the executioners would place a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. The sack was tied shut and thrown into a river. Imagine the darkness. Imagine the panic. As the water began to seep in, the animals, terrified and drowning, would turn on the only thing they could find, the human. The victim was bitten, scratched, and pecked while the water filled their lungs. It was a chaotic, thrashing death. Church choirs would sometimes stand on the riverbank, singing psalms to drown out the muffled screams and the sounds of animals fighting inside the bag. To the medieval mind, this wasn't just drowning, it was a symbolic return to a state of nature where the criminal was no better than a beast. When the sack finally stopped moving and sank to the bottom, the townspeople would often refuse to eat fish from that river for months. They believed the water was cursed by the betrayal. But as the river carried away the sack, the next method was already being prepared, a method that used insects and honey to turn a human body into a living hive of rot. As we reach the end of our journey into the medieval abyss, we find the methods that were designed to break not just the body, but the very concept of time. The first is scaphism, often called the boats. Although it originated in ancient Persia, medieval writers obsessed over it, using it as a terrifying benchmark for the worst possible fate. It was a death of absolute stagnation and filth. The condemned was placed inside a hollowed-out log or a small boat. Another boat was placed on top, with only the head, hands, and feet sticking out through holes. It looked like a wooden sandwich. Then, the executioners began the feeding. They forced the victim to drink large amounts of milk and honey. This caused massive, uncontrollable diarrhea within the wooden confines. Then, they smeared more honey on the victim's face, eyes, and groin. The boat was pushed into a stagnant marsh or tied to a post in the hot sun. The honey and the waste attracted every insect for miles. Flies, wasps, and beetles would swarm the victim, laying eggs in the rotting flesh. The person was eaten alive from the inside and the outside simultaneously. They couldn't move. They couldn't sleep. Guards would return every day to force-feed them more milk and honey, just to keep them alive and ensure the insects had a fresh food source. One soldier, Mithridates, reportedly survived for 17 days in this living hell. By the time he died, his body was no longer recognizable as human. It was a breathing hive of rot. But for those who needed a more public, more theatrical end, there was the saw. Sawing alive was a choice made by judges who wanted the crowd to see the internal workings of the law. This wasn't a quick decapitation. This was a slow, rhythmic labor. The prisoner was hung upside down, their legs tied apart to two tall poles. Why upside down? To keep the blood in the brain. The judges wanted the victim to stay conscious as long as possible. If the blood stayed in the head, the heart wouldn't fail so quickly. Two executioners would take a long, two-man saw. They would start at the groin. Imagine the sound, the metal teeth of the saw biting into bone and muscle while the town's children were forced to watch. Because they were upside down, many victims were still able to speak or scream even when the saw reached the abdomen. It was a cold, mechanical process. Some stories from 15th century Prague claim that if a victim confessed their sins midway through, the executioners would saw faster as a mercy. If they remained stubborn, they slowed down. People who witnessed these executions talked about them for decades. They swore they could hear the zip-zip sound of the blade in their dreams. The Middle Ages didn't just kill people, it transformed their suffering into a permanent part of the town's memory. These methods, the wheel, the stakes, the skin, the boiling water, the boats, and the saw, were the tools of a world that believed fear was the only thing holding society together. Today, we look back at these iron cages and rusted blades with a shudder. We see them in museums, silent and still. But if you listen closely to the echoes of history, you can still hear the screams that never truly faded. The past is never just the past, it is a warning. It shows us exactly what happens when humanity decides that mercy is a weakness and that the only way to lead is through the dark, cold precision of the executioner's hand. History is full of these shadows. Every stone in an old city square has likely tasted the blood of a lesson once taught. The question isn't how they could be so cruel. The question is, how did we ever survive long enough to find the light? If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.